Yesterday's prophecies, today's headlines. This is the Hal Lindsey Report. And now, Hal Lindsey.
Good evening and welcome to this edition of the Hal Lindsey Report. Like so many other enterprises, terrorism requires money, and money must have a source. Terrorists travel, they have expensive weapons, they build vast tunnel complexes, they feed their armies, they run recruiting and public relations campaigns, they buy off the masses with food and bribe government officials with cash. It all costs money. So where does that money come from? In late July, the New York Times ran an article called "Paying Ransoms, Europe Bankrolls Qatar Terror." The Times said, kidnapping Europeans for ransom has become a global business for Al-Qaeda, bankrolling its operations across the globe. Terrorists are involved in the kidnapping business and the international narcotics trade and human trafficking. They run prostitution rings and deal heavily in the black market arms trade. But all that together is not enough to keep the colossus of evil up and running. The primary funding for terrorism still comes from individuals and governments that are sympathetic to the terrorist cause. This is especially true in the case of Hamas. While they desperately want to develop their kidnapping business, so far, they've been thwarted. For now, they depend totally on the largesse of others. Missiles and rockets are not cheap, especially the more sophisticated variety now being used by Hamas. Terror tunnels aren't cheap either. The Israel Defense Force estimates that the Gaza terror tunnels cost an average of $3 million each. With over 40 known tunnels, that's more than $120 million. The Washington Times estimates the entire cost of the tunnel complex at $1 billion. The world is focused on Gaza's citizens. With all that money, imagine what could have been done to help those people. It took 350 truckloads of building supplies to create each tunnel. With all that material, how many homes, schools, businesses, or clinics could have been built for the civilians of Gaza? General James T. Conway, U.S. Marine Corps retired, visited Israel and saw the tunnels. He wrote in the Wall Street Journal, "Unlike tunnels that I had seen during the Iraq War that were designed for smuggling, this Hamas tunnel was designed for launching murder and kidnapping raid." The 3-mile-long tunnel was reinforced with concrete, lined with telephone wires, and included cabins unnecessary for infiltration operations, but useful for holding hostages. U.S. Representative Keith Ellison of Minnesota, the first Muslim to serve in the U.S. Congress, says the only hope is for Israel to put an end to the blockade of the Gaza Strip. After meeting with the Turkish and Qatari foreign ministers, Secretary of State John Kerry said, "The Palestinians can't have a ceasefire in which they think the status quo is going to stay, and they're not going to begin to have goods and services that come in from outside." Neither Secretary Kerry nor Representative Ellison mentioned that Israel isn't the only nation bordering Gaza. Egypt, too, has rigorous restrictions at the Gaza entry point. Both countries fear an open border because Gaza is run by terrorists with a long track record of brutal violence. Hamas uses everything at its disposal in its terror campaigns. The United Nations and others have criticized Israel for not allowing more construction material across the border. But in just this year, before the outbreak of hostilities, Israel allowed 181,000 tons of gravel, iron, cement, wood, and other building supplies through the Karim Shalom crossing, apparently on the assumption that Hamas can't make concrete missiles. But Hamas could make a vast network of sophisticated tunnels with electricity, ventilation, and holding cells for hostages. Some were large enough to accommodate wheeled vehicles. Others were already stocked with huge quantities of explosives. IDF spokesman Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner described it as Lower Gaza. He said, "It's like the underground, the metro, or the subway. These tunnels are all connected. I would describe it as Lower Gaza." Local Israeli television news is reporting that there may be as many as 5,000 administrative, command, logistical, or communication tunnels crisscrossing Gaza. It allows Hamas free movement underground all across the Gaza Strip. They describe it as the city under the city. We now know that Hamas was building dozens of major tunnels beneath the Israeli border to launch a major offensive on the beginning of the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, September the 24th, just over 6 weeks from now. The tunnels were their surprise weapon. The plan was for thousands of Hamas fighters to invade Israel through the tunnels during the night and spring their attack as shops opened and schools began. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that the number of Israeli dead would have been higher than 2,200 who died during the Yom Kippur War. Some analysts believe the death toll would have reached as high as 10,000, with hundreds of citizens kidnapped and held hostage. The plan also called for explosives already planted beneath Israeli kindergartens to be detonated first, creating mass hysteria and confusion. And the surprise might well have succeeded, if not for the tragic kidnapping of the 3 Israeli teenage boys in June. Their subsequent murders sparked the IDF operation that eventually led to the ground war, Operation Protective Edge. Of course, as a result of the IDF's entry into Gaza, the full extent of the terror tunnels was discovered. Israeli opposition leader Isaac Herzog said, "Those 3 boys saved the nation." Earlier, I asked the question, where does the money for Hamas terrorism come from? The Gaza terror tunnels cost a lot of money. Some analysts estimate as much as $1 billion. Missiles cost money. Who supplies that funding? In the case of Hamas, most of it comes from a single source. The nation of Qatar, which, by the way, is considered an ally of the United States. Qatar serves as an off-site headquarters for Hamas. They have publicly given $400 million to Hamas-led Gaza. They own the Al Jazeera network, a mouthpiece for anti-American and anti-Israel propaganda. As a nation, Qatar is family-owned and operated. No hint of democracy at all. It has a native population of only about 200,000, but with its vast oil money, employs over 2 million more foreign workers. Not only does Qatar fund Hamas, it also gives vast sums of money to other jihadist groups, including Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, the Islamic State, or ISIS, and the Muslim Brotherhood. Under a facade of money-made sophistication, it is a nation doing great harm to the people of the earth. Let's take a closer look at what Hamas says about itself. In its charter, Hamas gives its motto: Allah is its goal, the Prophet its model, the Quran its constitution, jihad its path, and death for the cause of Allah its most sublime belief. Those who would equate radical Islam with evangelical Christianity, please take note. Death is their most sublime belief. Contrast that with the words of Jesus. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they might have life and might have it abundantly. Islam glorifies death. Jesus Christ gives life. Hamas says Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. Obliterate leaves little room for negotiation. That's why when the Palestinian Authority agreed to a Palestinian unity government with Hamas, the peace talks with Israel ended like they had been shot in the head. Hamas doesn't want to talk. They don't even want war in the traditional sense. They want to obliterate. Hamas considers nationalism part and parcel of the religious faith. Nothing is loftier or deeper in Islamic nationalism than waging jihad against the enemy. When Jesus said, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, literally means ethnic group against ethnic group, he wasn't just referring to countries going to war, but to an end-time rise in nationalism as they see it. Article 13 of the Hamas Charter says, peace initiatives, the so-called peaceful solutions, and the international conferences to resolve the Palestinian problem are all contrary to the beliefs of the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas's official name. There is no solution to the Palestinian problem, according to them, except by jihad. It's no wonder that in April, when the bitter enemies Hamas and Fatah signed a reconciliation pact, it ended the American-sponsored peace talks. How do you have peace talks with people who say peaceful solutions are all contrary to their most fundamental beliefs? How can you have peace with a people who say there is no solution except by jihad?